The British Steel debacle that's been happening over the last week or so has highlighted a couple of deep structural issues that we have in Britain at the moment. We find ourselves, first of all, in the very, very strange place where we have people on the right of politics asking for nationalisation, and we have the people on the left of politics pushing back from that and wanting to go into partnership with the private sector.
Given that the Secretary of State has inferred that actually the owners, Jingye, are not acting and have not acted in good faith, surely the right thing to do is to seize this great opportunity now, this weekend, and nationalise British Steel.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear that a transfer of ownership to the state remains on the table. And it may well, at this stage, given the behaviour of the company, be the likely option. But also, our aspirations for British Steel remain a co-investment agreement with a private sector partner to secure that long-term transformation. The action I seek to take today is not a magic wand or a panacea. The state cannot fund the long-term transformation of British Steel itself, nor would it want to do so. But a failure to act today would prevent any more desirable outcome from even being considered. And that is, again, why we must act today.
Okay then, so there's two things to draw from this before we get into some deeper analysis. The first thing is to note the reason why British Steel is in the pickle that it found itself in is going back to the Conservatives, Cameron and Osborne. Cameron and Osborne allowed a Chinese company to have control over critical infrastructure in the UK in the 2010s. So they allowed it, and guess what China did? China came in and slowly, over a period of time, attempted to crush that industry very, very slowly so people didn't notice. Over the last decade and a half, they've tried to do that, and they've been quite efficient in doing that, whilst all the while shipping us cheap steel into the UK and the rest of the world, thus controlling the market, making them more powerful, whilst all the time shipping rubbish and badly made goods into the UK, while we've been buying them through a company called Amazon, who generally doesn't pay any tax into the country. You see how the globalised system works here in full effect, and so it's quite simple. Now we've reached a point where we need to get rid of them and take control back of critical infrastructure. Now, on the nationalisation point, what I will say is this. I'm from the right of politics. However, I'm not an ideologue. I believe that there are a few things that could be brought into the public sector that would help people generally in this country. So one of the things that I believe is steel. Steel is a crucial, fundamental part of any country's infrastructure, and that should be nationalised. Likewise, water companies. Likewise, energy companies. All of these things that are crucial, transport even. I'd be quite happy as a Conservative to look at nationalising those industries and bringing in some top professionals that might be worth their money in that instance to come in and have a look at how best to get, value for the public from that. I'm quite happy to do that. That's in itself is not a problem. So that's nationalisation, from the perspective of somebody on the right of politics. Take from that what you will. The other point, of course, to note is that Labour are compounding the issues to do with this. So here's another interview where, for once, Adam Bolton seems to be talking sense, and he asks the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, well, isn't this a bit to do with net zero, Jonathan? What's your thoughts on that, mate?
The reason we've got a steel strategy, the reason we've got significant resources, £2.5 billion allocated to the steel fund by the government on top of the 500 million that's already going to Port Talbot, is to make sure that we are bringing in the most exciting and new investments that we can to make sure we're not relying on infrastructure that was put in place in some cases nearly 100 years ago.
Problem we've got, the reason why the taxpayer is now going to be on the hook losing £700,000 a day is because we've got the most expensive energy in Europe, in the G7. And unless you can do something about that, which probably means looking again at green targets, it's just going to go on being a money pit, isn't it?
Energy prices, our competitiveness, industrial and energy prices, is something that is a personal obsession of mine. I think you and I, again, have talked about this previously. It's a mistake to think
But it's a
that
disaster
it's somehow
at the moment,
a
isn't
trade-off
it?
between...
I'm just saying that, the reason why it's going to cost the taxpayer so much is because we have such high energy prices, isn't it?
Look, so part of the losses of British Steel are because the assets have such a vintage to them, and that's hard to compete on the global stage. Our energy prices are something we're looking at, particularly in the Department of Business and Trade. Really, our industrial energy prices, they rose a lot under the previous government, in real terms by half as much again, 50% rise. So it is a significant issue. It's about how we run the overall grid and the network charges and how that compares to other countries. But the key issue is the price of gas sets the price of electricity most days in the UK. That's different to France, where it would be nuclear, or say Norway, where it would be hydro lots of days. So it's a mistake to think that fossil fuels are somehow the way to cheap energy supplies. It's our exposure to gas which is a major problem.
Righty-ho. So, depending on how you view the current net zero debate, you will draw different things from that. For me, it's quite hard to actually cram as much rubbish into one segment as Jonathan Reynolds did there. Our dependence on fossil fuels, yes, the whole world runs on something called diesel. So everything that's made, even the suit that Mr. Reynolds has got there, the microphone, the camera on him, everything about that whole interaction there that you saw was made by diesel. All machines run on something called diesel, so the world in effect runs on something called fossil fuels. In addition to that, there's no recognition of why the UK has one of the highest energy costs in the world. This steel thing that's happening at the moment is a direct result of the inefficiencies of the British energy system. It's the same for all countries. All countries buy gas. All countries have to produce energy. All countries have to use their natural resources. But Mr. Miliband is pushing us down this course, and you'll see here, when confronted with the absolute reality of the situation, how are we going to make British steel work when we have the highest energy costs in the world almost? And what does Mr. Reynolds say? He comes back with, this is the right thing to do. We need to stop our reliance on fossil fuels. So you see the problem here. The government is hell-bent on this, and I've said this before. It doesn't matter what they're confronted with on this issue. And people keep going on and on about it. They are going to push this through. As Keir Starmer said, we want to win net zero. We want to be the world leader in net zero. So this is part of the result of that ideology and philosophy playing out in reality, in the eyes of the British public and the media. And I think this is a damning indictment of the Labour Party's ideology in general terms. Now, all of that aside, that recap there is something that I wanted to point out more generally. So, as you may have already guessed, I'm a Geordie. I'm from the northeast, and particularly, specifically from the Newcastle area. And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out a couple of things to you that I've noticed in my middle age, shall I say, that really point to the great decline, I would call it, of British society. Now, we're not going to talk about people and culture. What I'm talking about is the land that we live in and the general ethos behind that. Okay? So, before we get to Newcastle, I'm going to show you this picture here. Now, this is a picture of something called the Ribbleshead Viaduct. Now, you may not know this about me, but I'm a hiker and a wild camper. And I'm frequently to be found in places like the Lake District, but also once a year I try and get my old bones nice and supple, and I attempt to do the 3 Peaks Challenge with a full pack, I might add, and I camp along the way, just in case you were interested in how I did that. But along the way, there's a massive landmark called the Ribbleshead Viaduct, and you're looking at it here. Now, this was made in 1875. Now, when you get up close to it, The photos don't really do it justice. You can see it even when you are in the area and you can see it from the road, but you have to really walk up to this thing and stand underneath it to appreciate the absolute majesty, and that's the best word that I can use for it, the absolute majesty of this construction. And this was made in a different time. And this isn't an architectural channel, anything like that. I have no expert knowledge whatsoever in architect. I'm just looking at this from a philosophical point of view. And when you're standing under this, and I've had my lunch under this viaduct quite a few times as I've been hiking past it, because it's such a great place to sit and, contemplate the world and rest your legs for half an hour before they fall off. But aside from that, when you're there and you're looking at it, you can actually appreciate something of the history of this country. I remember a line that David Starkey used, and I was listening to one of his lectures recently, and he said, if you want to appreciate the history and the breadth of culture of Britain, all you have to do is walk into a church and look around. And that's correct, that thought process. And I find this when I'm looking at historical construction, architecture. And when you look at something like the Ribbles Head Viaduct, it took my breath away. It takes my breath away every time I see it. Because we are not able, as a society, to produce that again. It's not possible for us to do that now. Whatever the reasons for that, who knows what reason it is, but we as a society are unable to produce this. Likewise, here's a picture of Newcastle city centre. Now, I like walking around Newcastle city centre, and the buildings, the architecture in there is fabulous. You walk all around and it's there for everybody to see. Now, this was mainly made starting in the 1830s, so I gather after a bit of research this morning. And from here, I'll take you to the 1960s, to a place in Newcastle called Cruddas Park. Now, you'll see these flats here, these abominations that stretch from the earth. Now, first of all, if you do live in Cruddas Park, I don't know if anybody listening does that, needs to be borne in mind, I'm from Newcastle, and I've had friends that live in Cruddas Park, so before you have a go at me about that, don't. I've been in these flats, and so I know all about them. But I find this picture here of this gentleman taking a photograph and, trying to propose to you, like, look at this bit of art on the grass in front of it, and isn't this a cool modern design? Like, this is where our society has gone, and you see the difference from Newcastle in the 1830s to Newcastle in the 1960s. Likewise, here's the Tyne Bridge. There's the Tyne Bridge there. And the Tyne Bridge itself was made in 1928. And the swing bridge at the time was the largest swing bridge in the world. That was made in 1876, so 150 years ago. And likewise, the Tyne Bridge 100 years ago. And here's a picture of the Millennium Bridge. Now, I walk across the Millennium Bridge from time to time, and it feels like you're walking across a toy. Now, I'm sure the construction's safe and it's very cool and it's all lightweight and it pivots on its thing and all that. But that bridge there isn't going to be there in 100 years. It's just not. And when you actually get up close to the Tyne Bridge and you actually look at it, you'll see that it's a formidable construction of itself, but it is undergoing restorations. When you get really close to it, you'll see that there's a lot of rust on the Tyne Bridge, the famous Tyne Bridge. And there's a lot of degradation there. For all it looks fabulous, and it's the landmark of Newcastle, for want of a better word, it is degrading over time. And so, what am I saying here? What am I trying to tell you? Well, we've forgotten the old ways. And I'm starting to sound like an old man here, and I definitely don't want to do that. But we have forgotten what it means to make things of significance. We've forgotten what it means to make things that are going to last. Everything in life has turned into this disposable mess. I mean, you walk around places like Primark and you look at clothing that falls apart after, the fifth or sixth time. And I've got, a couple of pairs of jogging pants from Primark, so I'm not casting aspersions here. I have bought things from Primark in the past. But you understand what I'm saying here. These things, the modern way that we've constructed our society on a deep, fundamental level, on something that's buried in the bones of how we used to live and how we're living now, there's a fault line developed. We are not able to make the grand things we made in the past. We're not even able to have a functioning steel plant in the country. And who's responsible? Successive governments from the last 100 years are responsible. That's who. And nobody gets let off the hook. You could actually say, I'm probably being unfair there, you could actually say from about the 1950s onwards perhaps that, and those of you who understand history, who, may have a better understanding than me, I was born in the 70s, so, in terms of going further back, I can't do that. I can remember something of the 70s and the 80s, but even back then, we made stuff of significance. Nowadays, it's all gone. And, this modernism, this globalization that's afflicted us, and people like Jonathan Reynolds here, standing with a straight face, trying to tell us that no, fossil fuels are the thing of the past. We need to be moving forward. Well, this could be Jonathan Reynolds in this picture here in front of the Cruddas Park flats. That's a good metaphor for Jonathan Reynolds here. He's lying. Or he's deluded. Either way, he's dangerous. And this is how politicians, going back decade after decade after decade, have destroyed some of the fundamental things in our society. And I don't think we're ever going back to things like the Ribble's Head Viaduct. I think those projects, those grand projects of the past, are gone forever. We simply don't have the manpower. The regulations aren't in place, or are in place, I should say, to prevent such a thing from happening. And the costs associated with it, everything's out of whack because of globalisation. So those days are gone. And I'm not coming at this from doom perspective. I always have hope for the future, and I hope for a better future every time. And that's partly why I'm doing this, because I hope we can move forward and we can make a better country for ourselves. But people like Jonathan Reynolds here, talking rubbish, he's making our country poorer by not acknowledging the simple basic fact. Government is not in control of industry. It's not. And so what the government needs to do, even forgetting what I discussed earlier about steel being nationalised, the government needs to be taking a step back from its involvement in a lot of major business. What it needs to do, it needs to understand that when it touches something, it blackens it and it turns it to dust. It's as simple as that. It ruins it. And Jonathan Reynolds here doesn't seem to understand that the world runs on diesel. Ed Miliband doesn't seem to understand that in the North Sea we have plenty of resources which we should be exploiting. We should also be exploiting fracking, in my opinion. There's a lot of things that we should be doing. But this government's relentless pursuit of net zero is on its way to bankrupting this country. And without any shadow of a doubt, energy is important to a civilization. A modern civilization requires higher and higher energy consumption. And there hasn't been any inventions recently that is going to change our complete reliance, or almost complete reliance, on fossil fuels. What we need to do is develop the inventions going forward, while at the same time using the natural resources that we have. And I think most people in the country feel like that, but this man here, he's part of the problem along with Ed Miliband and this government. And who knows how long it's going to take them to change course, if they ever do decide to change course. Anyway, thanks very much for your time.